few days to prepare for this one. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av, Benjamin and Elise Wall of Netanya, Eretz Yisrael, who have dedicated all of the Sherman Joshos this month in the merit of Moshe Abramson and Jeremy Lassen, who Baruch Hashem worked so hard to make sure that those who are outside of the physical base medrash are able to, Meretz Hashem, be part of the shir, and Meretz Baruch Hu should reward them for all of their efforts. Thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Aaron and Alana Weinberg, with gratitude to Hashem on the 12th anniversary of the refuah of their son Yonatan Shai, and Saeed and Simah Haken for the refuah shleim of Avram ben Zinat, and the hatzlacha for the entire family. We hope that in Meretz Hashem, he has a true refuah in Meretz Hashem with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But so with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is daf Samech Hey 65, and we're actually picking up right by the two dots on Samech Daled Amud Beis 64b. So really a lot to do today. So remember, again, the Mishnah said, so the Mishnah explained that anyone who does not know, any person or any woman or any girl who does not know how to guard her get, ultimately, again, cannot get divorced. So Tan Rabbana, so the idea over here is, on the most basic level, in order for a woman to get divorced, she has to have das. What's the basic definition of das? That she's able to go ahead and literally look after a document. So it says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, Kitano hayodas lishmar es gida miskareshes. A kitano who has the ability to go ahead and watch her get, literally guard her get, ultimately again gets divorced. V'sheni yodas lishmar es gida. But a girl who does not know how to go ahead and watch her get, eno miskareshes, ultimately again cannot get divorced. Ve'ezu hi kitano yodas lishmar es gida. What do you mean when you speak about the kitana who has the ability to guard her get? How does that manifest itself? Any girl who could watch her get and guard her get and something else. So the Gemara says, Micah, what does that mean, guard her get and something else? Micah Amar, Rabbi Yochanan Kamar, davar acher mach mosquito. This is very interesting. So Rabbi Yochanan said, ultimately, any girl who's able to go ahead and literally watch something else, thinking that it's her get. So she watches over an item, thinking that ultimately, again, this item is her get, and she's able to sufficiently guard it. So Gemara says, ha shota ba'almahi. I don't understand. If she's watching, a book, and she thinks that that's her get, the fact that she's able to sufficiently guard it, what about the fact that obviously she doesn't know what a get is, right? If she thinks that something else is the get, and she's guarding that because she thinks that that's the get, so he calls that's a shota. Now that might be a little bit hyperbolic, because that's the shota, but the idea is, if she doesn't know, in other words, the fact that she has the ability to guard something, but doesn't know what it is that she's guarding, how does that represent das? To which the Gemara says, Amar Rafuna bar Manuach mishmei diravacha b'rei dravika kol shemavchenes ben gitla davar acher. So now we'll say, what's the definition of a? So now remember, I want to be clear. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about a kitana who has the ability to get divorced. So essentially, when could a kitana when does she have the ability to get divorced? If she's able to watch over her get. What's the definition of being able to watch over her get? So literally, again, she understands what the get is, and she is able to responsibly guard it. Kol shemavchenes ben gitla davar acher. She could distinguish between a get and something else. Amar Rabbi Huda, Amar Rabbi, Amar Asi. So I'll say the Gemara gives examples of this. So this is actually really, really very interesting. So I'll say it's also fascinating that let's take a look. Amar Rabbi Huda, Amar Rabbi Osi. So Sror v'zargo, egos v'notlo, Zochel yatzmo, ve'ina zochel echem. So now that we brought up this discussion about kitana, so now we've been introduced, remember, just to follow the progression over here. So the Mishnah highlighted this idea that any girl who is capable, yechola lishmar as gita, is able to guard or watch over her get, can get divorced. If she can't guard or watch over her get, she can't get divorced. The Gemara now gave us a definition. What does it mean that she could guard lishmor as gita? It means really two things. Number one, she's able to distinguish between what is a get and what's not a get, and she's able to watch over it. She's able to watch over it. So now that we've spoken about this idea that ultimately the ability to guard something or watch over something represents represents a certain level of mental capacity, the Gemara expands this conversation. This is really very interesting. So comes on Rabbi Yehuda, says in the name of Rabbi Yossi, Surar v'zarko, egos v'notlo, zochel yatzma ben zochel acherim. If a katan has the ability to say, if you give him a stone and he throws it away, and a nut, and he holds on to it. In other words, we're talking about over here a child who has the capacity to be able to distinguish between something valuable and something valueless. Right? So you give him a stone, he's like, what is this good for? Right? Throws it away. But a nut, he understands again, has value. So when a katan reaches that level of capacity, zochel yatzmo vein zochel acherim, he has the ability to acquire on his own behalf, but does not have the ability to go ahead and acquire on behalf of others. I will say, by the way, think about this just also from a hashkafic perspective. What is the most basic level of personalistic maturation? When you know what's good and what's not good. Right? On the most basic level, when do you have the ability to accomplish zochel yatzmo? When do you have the ability to accomplish something in life? When do you have that ability, that capacity? Ultimately, again, when you know what to take and what to discard. I will say, is this not the first unit of personalistic accomplishment? What should I take and what should I discard? What's worth investing my time and my efforts in? And what's ultimately, again, just a misuse of my personalistic commodities. So the katan on the most basic level knows a stone, it's not going to do anything for me. So discard it. The nut is valuable. First step in growth in life is knowing what should you hold on to and what should you discard. What are the things that are going to further your life mission? And ultimately, again, what are the things that ultimately are just going to hold you back? Or for that matter, just create the waste of time. So next level, chayvetz umachzir la'achar shah. But listen to this, if you could borrow something, if the katan could borrow something, right, and then return it an hour later, so I'll say this represents a heightened level of das, where the person, in this case the katan, has the ability, again, to take something from someone else and has enough of a developed thought process to understand, I have to return it after a defined amount of time. Zocha bein liatzmo ubein la'acherim. Both say in that case, ultimately, again, he has the ability to acquire on his own behalf, and ultimately, again, on behalf of others as well. So I will say, what's the pshat with this? What's the pshat? Also such a profound lesson. What this represents, I will say, is a heightened level of awareness, ultimately, again, of responsibility towards the other. Right? So first step of personal maturation is ultimately responsibility to self. I know what I should take and what I should discard, what's helpful and what's detrimental. That's step one. Step two is feeling a sense of achrayus towards the other. What level of responsibility do I have towards the other? How does that manifest itself? You borrow something, and then you have the ability to return it. I would say, of course, on a much deeper level, this yisod ultimately, again, of chayfetz umachzir la'acher. I would say, what's the greatest example of chayfetz umachzir la'acher? It's the neshama, right? It's the neshama. I get a neshama ultimately, again, when I come down into this world, and after 120, machzira li'acher, I have to give that back to the Ribono Shel Olam. The fact that I know that one day I have to return my soul to my Maker. And ultimately, again, I have one job in this world, one job. And that job is to return that neshama in even better shape than I received it, which might not be totally possible, but at least in as good shape as I received, but hopefully even better shape. Let's say that's the next step of personalistic maturation. So step one is recognizing what you should do, what you should take, what you should discard. What are the things that are going to help you on the journey of life? What are the things that are going to hold you back? Second step in personalistic maturation is understanding, again, your achrayus to the other. Whatever you take, give back. And ultimately, again, even on a deeper level, understand that the ultimate chayfetz during the Shema is something you have to return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say, okay, but back to the Pashut Pshat. When the Katan gets to this level that he can borrow something and then return it, Zocha bein la'asma bein la'achirim. Ultimately, he has the ability to go ahead and be Zocha, ultimately towards others, or I should say, has the ability to acquire on behalf of himself and on behalf of others. Fine, so when he said this over in front of Shmuel, Amar li Davida achasi. Shmuel said, no, both of these are the same level. My Davida achasi, what does that mean? So we'll say, ultimately, again, Rav Chisda said, really in both of these cases, both of the katan, ultimately, again, who knows to throw away the stone, keep the nut, as well as borrow something and return it. Both of these represent a level of maturity where he can acquire on behalf of himself, but he does not have the ability to acquire on behalf of others. In other words, what Rav Chisda is introducing is a katan can never really acquire on behalf of, can never acquire on behalf of other people. The most he could do is acquire on behalf of himself. Master Rav Chinana Vardan, so Rav Chinana Vardan brought up a shayla. He brought up a contradiction. It was an interesting case. Ketzan mishtatfin b'mavoy. I will say back to our Erevin days. Remember again, shituf muvaos, right? What's a shituf muvaos? So I will say, so remember again, so in the Talmudic housing model, so remember again, you had multiple homes that opened up into a shared chutzner, shared courtyard, right? Multiple courtyards that opened up ultimately again into a shared mavoi, alleyway. So the same way that homes ultimately have to go ahead and make an Erev Chatzeros, right, in order to join them into common ownership. So multiple Chatzeros have to create a sheet of muvos for joint ownership into the alleyway. Okay, we're not getting into all the technicalities over here. So I say, how do you do that? So food, right? Food is always the great uniter, right, amongst Jewish people. So Lamaisa, again, for sheet of muvos, you can use a barrel of wine. Fine. So in that event, how do you make a sheet of muvos? So they would take a barrel of wine. Ultimately, again, they would announce this barrel of wine belongs to all the residents of the mavoi. Now remember, to say it belongs to everyone is not enough. What do you have to do? You have to convey ownership to someone. Someone has to acquire it on behalf of the bnei mavoi. Who does that? You can even do it through your adult children, right? Or or through your Jewish servants. Okay, interesting. So Gemara says, let's analyze this. Watch this. Hi shivcha hechi dami. Rabbi say, what's the case of shivcha who has the? Now watch this. What's the case of shivcha who has the ability to acquire this shituf on behalf of the other residents of the mavui? If it's a shivcha brought 2 hairs, in other words, she develops signs of physical maturation, i.e., she's an adult. So my baya gabe. I will say a Jewish shivcha, a Jewish maidservant, goes free as soon as she exhibits signs of physical maturation. So you couldn't have that. Ella lavdalo asya shtei saros. Or rather, I will say it must be that she is still not a gidola. She's still a kitana, right? Vikatani, and yet what do you see from here? Vikatani zochel achirim. He'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Chalamai, so she must be still a kitana, yet there is the ability for her to go ahead and acquire something on behalf of others. On behalf of others. So Rabbi say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that Allah Chalamai, like Rabbi Yehuda was saying, that there is the ability for a katan or a kitana to acquire on behalf of others, to acquire on behalf, as long as they reach some level of developed cognition. Right? In Rabbi Yehuda's model, the level of developed cognition was what? That they have the ability to go ahead and chayfetz umachziro. right? They have the ability to borrow something and return it. Now I will say, now remember again, this is being posed as a kasha on Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda wanted to say a katan never has the ability to acquire on behalf of someone else. The most a katan could do is when they reach some level of maturity, they could what? They could what? Acquire on their own behalf. Here you clearly see a case where the katan is acquiring on behalf of the members of the mavoi. So it's a contradiction to Rav Chisda, to which the Gemara says, no. So the Gemara says, so Amar Rav Chisda, ishtik vardan. I'm sorry, let's skip the line. The Gemara says, shiny shtufe mavos, dirabanan. No, so ultimately, this is not a good kasha. Why? Because this is sheet of mavos. Sheet of mavos, we'll say, is dirabanan. So it could be that in the case of a dirabanan, will allow a katan to go ahead and acquire on behalf of someone else. Rav Chisda said, ishtik vardan. Ultimately, again, Rav Chinina Vardan, Vardan is the name of his place. Rav Chinina Vardan ultimately, again, was silenced. In other words, again, we refuted his refutation. My Havadeh Mimar. So we'll say, what could Rav Chisda, what could Rav Chinina Vardan, what could he have answered? Havadeh Mimar, he could have said, called the Tikkun Rabbanan, I will say, top of Samachay 65a, first line, called the Tikkun Rabbanan, Ke'ein De'araisa Tikkun. So Rav Chinina Vardan could have answered, anytime the rabbis make a law, they make a law like a da'araisa. So therefore, I will say, the fact, so we'll say, just to follow the progression over here, you have ultimately, again, I just want to get my names correct over here. You have Rav Yehuda ultimately telling us, introducing a model, just to follow. Rav Yehuda introducing a model in the name of Rabbi Asi, introducing a model that a katan, when he reaches a certain level of cognition, i.e., throws away the stone, keeps the nut, that level of das allows him to acquire on behalf of himself, right? When he reaches an additional level of developed cognition, i.e., he borrows something and is able to return it, he's able to go ahead and acquire on behalf of himself and on behalf of others, okay? Comes along Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda then said no. Rav Chisda said no. The most a katan could ever do is acquire on his own behalf, but never acquire on behalf of others. Rav Chinina Vardan came and posed a question to Rav Chisda and brought a case that showed us that a katan is able to go ahead and acquire on behalf of the other. What was that case? Shetufe muvaos. Right? They want to make a sheet of muvaos. So what does it say? Let's say again, we also imagine we all live in the same mavoi. I'm supplying the barrel of wine for the sheet of muvaos. I put it in the mavoi, or I put it in my house, and I say ultimately, or my chatzar, I say, okay, this is for all the bnei hamavoi. Now, that's fine, but someone else has to acquire it on behalf of the members of the mavoi. So the Gemara says, who could do that? Who could do that? Even my shifcha, my Jewish maidservant. Then I will say, how old is my Jewish maidservant? She can't be an adult, because if she's adult, then what? Then she's free. So it must be that she's a kitana. Obviously, she's a kitana. And yet, what is she doing? She is acquiring the sheet of muvaos on behalf of the bnei mavoi. What do you see from here? That a kitana has the ability to acquire on behalf of others. So I will say, this refutes Rav Chisda and seems to be a support ultimately again for Rav Yehuda, to which the Gemara says, no, this is not a refutation, because what is this? This is a din d'Rabbanan. This is rabbinic law. Okay, so maybe in rabbinic law, we allow a katan to go ahead and acquire on behalf of others. To which the Gemara says, but by the way, if Rav Chinina Vardan, if he wanted to say that this is still good proof, he could have said, even if it is a d'Rabbanan, whenever the Rabbanan legislate law, they legislated how? Like a d'Oraisa. So if it wouldn't work by a d'Oraisa, they wouldn't legislate it by a d'Rabbanan, which once again seems to restore the contradiction and seems to tell us that a katan can acquire on behalf of others. The idach, the other would say, Ki Arminan called the Tikkun Rabbanan Kein d'Oraisa, Tikkun B'milsa de Isla Ikra Min HaTorah. When do we say that the Rabbanan legislate law like a d'Oraisa? That's only when what they're legislating has its source in biblical law. Aval milsa delesta ikra min haTorah lo. I will say it's something that does not have its root, right? Its source in the Torah. Ultimately, again, Chazal do not structure their law like a d'Oraisa. So I will say, so shit of mavaos, which is a purely rabbinic law, ultimately need not resemble biblical law. Fine. Master Avavia. So I will say, so again, we're still in our machlokes here. So remember again, on one hand, we have Rav Chisda, we have Rabbi Huda, we have, I keep on forgetting the names. Rabbi Huda in the name of Rabbi Asi, I'm just going to underline my Gemara, right? Rabbi Huda in the name of Rabbi Asi, ultimately saying that a katan, when he reaches a certain level of a cognition, does have the ability to acquire on behalf of others. And then ultimately, again, Rav Chisda telling us that no, a katan at most could only go ahead and acquire on behalf of himself. So now another kasha. Master Rav Avia. This is a great case. Marimin ala meiser sheni. We'll say this is fascinating. If you want, you could circumvent the laws of meiser sheni. I will say now, what are the laws of meiser sheni? We know what is meiser sheni. Meiser sheni is the tithe that is yours, belongs to the landowner or the produce owner, but you have to eat it in Yerushalayim Yirah Kodesh. Now, if you want, what can you do? You could redeem your Meiser Sheni on money, or really what you could do is you could transfer Meiser Sheni sanctity onto money. Now, the halacha is when you do that, that's fine, totally permitted. When you do that, if you're redeeming Meiser Sheni, you have to add on an additional fifth, right? The chomesh, 1/5, right? So you add on 1/5 of the value onto the money. Now, we'll say, now when is that true? That's only true when you're redeeming your own Meiser Sheni. But watch this. If someone else is redeeming your Meiser Sheni, right, with their money, then halacha l'maisa, there is no din of the fifth. Okay? Interesting. So watch this. You could exploit this halacha. So Master of Avia, marimina Meiser Sheni. If you want, you could circumvent the laws of Meiser Sheni. How so? Kesad, Omer Adam libno ubito agidolim. A person could say to his adult children, la'avdo v'shivchas ha'ivrim, or to your Jewish servant or maidservant, halachai ma'os halalu. I'm giving you a gift. So we'll say, imagine for a moment, I have $1,000 in Meiser Sheni. Okay? So now, if I redeem the Meiser Sheni, I have to redeem the $1,000 plus an additional fifth. So I have a great idea. What do? I give either my adult son, my adult daughter. The reason adult children, I will say why, is because the assumption is adult children are financially independent. It's a big assumption, right? But Lamaisa, again, assuming my adult children are financially independent. Okay, so now I will say, so I could give my adult children or my Jewish servant or maidservant, here's $1,000. It's yours. It's yours. But do me a favor. Now that you now are the proud owner of $1,000, would you mind redeeming my Meiser Sheni? And I will say, if they do so, it works. And I will say, what could they do? So now they can redeem my Meiser Sheni, and guess what? They can redeem the Meiser Sheni. I will say, when they redeem the Meiser Sheni, then what? What don't they have to add on? What don't they have to add on? The fifth. So I will say, and this is a totally legal loophole. Total legal loophole. The Meiser Sheni is redeemed. The $1,000 now has Meiser Sheni sanctity. And again, because they've redeemed this, someone other than the owner of the produce has redeemed it, no additional fifth. Good. Totally legal loophole. So, hi Shivcha Yichidami. So, by the way, what's the case of Shivcha? Who's the Shivcha redeeming this? So, Ida Asebe Saros, my Bayagabe. If she's developed signs of physical maturation, then she's no longer Shivcha, she's a free woman. Elalav. Rather, it has to be that what? She has not sprouted signs of physical maturation, right? So therefore, we'll say if she hasn't sprouted signs of physical maturation, then what is she? What is she? A kitana. And what is she doing? She's really acquiring something, so to speak, on my behalf. In other words, we'll say she's affecting some type of halachic reality on my. A kitana is kitana is redeeming my Meiser Sheni. So I will say, I just want to point out, remember, you could have a case, ultimately, again, of an Eved Ivri who is a Gadol, right? How do you have a case of an Eved Ivri who is a Gadol? An Eved Ivri has the ability to go ahead and stay in servitude for a prolonged amount of time, right? And Amma Ivriya normally does not. Okay, what's the case here? Well, says great. The Meiser Bizman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. Ultimately, we're talking about again, Meiser Sheni Bizman Hazeh, which is D'Rabbanan. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says that's therefore I will say. So the simple answer is we're doing a D'Rabbanan. So maybe in a D'Rabbanan, ultimately again, Einachinami, a katan does have the ability to go ahead and acquire something on behalf of someone else. To which the Gemara says, one second. But one second. If you're talking about Meiser Sheni Bizman Hazeh, so we'll say that's Meiser Sheni B'Drabanan, Amo Ivriya doesn't apply Bizman Hazeh. That Tanya we learned, Ein Evet Ivri Noig, Ela Bizman Shayovel Noig. We'll say the concept of Jewish servitude only applies when Yovel applies. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi for just a moment. Ela Bizman Shayovel Noig. See, I will say Jewish servitude is fundamentally tied into Yovel, right? Because remember again, why? Because remember again, the Eved Ivri has the ability to extend his term, right? If he becomes a pure Eved, he has the ability to go and extend his term. But Lamais again, Yovel marks the end of all Jewish servitude. So therefore, Jewish servitude is linked to Yovel. We'll say Yovel only applies when? Yovel only applies when? Ultimately, when the majority of Klal Yisrael resides in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, the Gemara says, I don't understand. So Lamaisa, again, if we're talking about Ma'aser Sheni Bizman Hazeh, then there's no Avdos Bizman Hazeh. To which the Gemara says, so rather you have to say, no, this must be talking about a time when Ma'aser Sheni applied Midaraisa, and therefore servitude applied Midaraisa. So what's the case over here? The case here, Rabbi says, interestingly enough, is a case of Ma'aser Sheni that was coming from a non-perforated flower pot. So Rabbi will say, okay, so now everyone will agree that a case of a produce grown in a non-perforated flower pot is what I will say, is what? Is only chayiv midrabanan in Trumas and Maasros because it's not attached to the ground. So that would be a case of a drabanan where a katan ultimately again could go ahead and serve as my agent. Okay, Amar Rava. So I'll say Rava comes along and says something very interesting. Gimel midos bekatan. So I'll say Rava wants to create the following framework. He essentially says there's 3 different categories when it comes to a katan. What are the 3 categories? Sirar v'zarko, egos v'notlo, zochel yatzmo, v'ein zochel acherim. So I will say, if you have a katan, and again, what we mentioned before, you give him a nut, you give him a stone, he throws it away. You give him a nut, and he keeps it. So I will say, this is the first level of developed mental capacity, where he has the ability to acquire on behalf of himself, but does not have the ability to acquire on behalf of someone else. So I will say, so remember again, the concept of keeping this nut, throwing away the stone, represents a basic level of developed mental or intellectual capacity. So in this level, he's able to affect change or to acquire something on behalf of himself, not for others. Ukinegdan, I will say, the way the Gemara is framing this is like for boys and for girls, the corresponding level of cognition for a girl, kinegdan, biktana, miskadeshes lemion. So I will say, on the corresponding level for a girl, she ultimately, again, would be able to go ahead and engage in rabbinic marriage. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, kinegdan biktana, chashev la yodas lishmar kidushel, umiskadeshes bikidushe ima, o ha'acheha ledaita, or bikabalas atzma misomahi. So remember again, Midoraisa, father has the ability to betroth his daughter. If there's no father, so brother or mother have the ability to enter the ketana into marriage. What kind of marriage is that? D'Rabbanan. But I will say the same way that technically brother or mother could enter her into rabbinic marriage, she could also agree herself to enter into rabbinic marriage. But what level of intellectual capacity does she have to have in order to be able to enter into rabbinic marriage? This same level. You give her a stone, she throws it away. You give her a nut, she keeps it. In other words, if she has that basic level of developed cognition, she has the ability to enter into rabbinic marriage. We'll say, how do you get out of rabbinic marriage? How do you get out of rabbinic marriage? Miyun. You don't even need to get, technically, right? Miyun. What does miyun mean? Refusal. Refusal simply means she says, I don't want this anymore. Look at Rashi. The miyun shetzrich lamayim ve'enu yotze below miyun. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, so it's the same level, right? So in other words, on the level, so when a katan or kitana reaches the level ultimately, again, where you give them a nut, they keep it, give them a stone, they throw it away. So with this represents the level where ultimately, again, they could acquire on behalf of themselves, but not on behalf of others. Okay, next, haputos. Mekhan mekach umemkarn memkarn. So I'll say pu'utos. Remember, we saw this before a couple of days ago in the Gemara. So pu'utos really represents the age, right? Ultimately, again, of 6, 7, 8 years old, where there's some level of developed mental capacity. So pu'utos mekchan mekach, what they sell is sold, or I should say what they purchase is purchased, umemkaran memkar, what they sell is sell, b'metaltalin, ultimately a movable property. So we'll say, so this is the next level of developed cognition. Pu'utos, where ultimately, again, transactionally they understand what is happening, and therefore, again, their transactions are recognized in halacha only by movable property. U'kinegdan b'kitana miskadeshes b'kidushe aviha. And I will say again, the corresponding case would be in a kitana, right? This would be the age, ultimately, again, where halacha l'maisa, if her father were to betroth her, it would be an effective kiddushin. I will say, Rashi points out over here, what age is this? This is the age where if her father marries her off, she's not going to run back home, right? Mishalcha ve'eno chozeres. Ultimately, again, she's sent away and she won't return. Higia la'onas nadarim. So I'll say that's the second level of developed maturation. Third level, higia la'onas nadarim. Once a boy or a girl reaches the age of nadarim, now both say, remember this back in our nadarim days, this is a year before bar or bas mitzvah, where we assume that a boy or a girl has reached a heightened level of cognition, where they understand the meaning of a vow and they understand how to keep a vow. So for a girl, this would be the age of 11. For a boy, this would be the age of 12. Higila onas nadarim, nidreha nedar, vekdeshan hekdish. So their nedarim is a proper neder, and their hekdish is a proper hekdish. Ukinegdan bekitana cholatzes, and I will say this would be the age over a kitana. Ultimately, again, would also be cognitively developed enough that she'd be able to do chalitza. So I will say, so that's the third level. So I will say, so again, 3 different levels of maturation of a katan. So there's velimkar, the last level, which is not really the right. Velimkar b'nichse aviv. We'll say, what about how old do you have to be in order to go ahead and sell off your father's property? Ach yehei ben esrim, until you're 20. I was going to say, now that last level is a little bit of an outlier. What that's talking about, we'll say, is in general. Remember again, we spoke about extensively this concept of apotropis, of Beis Din going ahead and setting up an executor of the estate to care for the needs of the estate until the yasam, until the orphan becomes a gadol. Now let's remember again, a number of times the Gemara said, what does gadol mean? Gadol does not assume that the yisomim are children, but rather what it means is it takes a while for a child to become educated in the estate of his father, especially if the father has vast holdings, to know what to do, how to sell. So often, again, when do we say that a child becomes of the age to go ahead and sell off the property of the estate? 20 years old. That's when he has enough knowledge. Again, so we'll say, sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our head around these levels of maturation in a katan, because for us, these all sound like children. And when we think about children, again, certainly they don't seem to have developed capacity until much, much later. But again, obviously there was times of the Gemara, people matured much faster. Right, it certainly had to mature much faster, given the times. In any event, so I'll say, so just an interesting construct over here of Rava creating the Gimel Midos Bakatan. The 3 different categories, the 3 different levels of maturation, and at each different level, they're able to affect some additional level of halachic change. Incredible. Mishnah, Kitana Shamar Hiskabel Giti. We'll say another interesting case. A Kitana said, Hiskabel Giti. They will say, so this is talking about, again, so the woman is married. It could be a case of where her father married her off. Right? And what happens? She tries to make a shliach lekabbalah. And everyone say, a kitana cannot make a shliach lekabbalah. All right? And therefore, eno get achiagia get liada. Ultimately, again, the get is not a valid get until it reaches her hands. Okay? So the fichach, therefore, imratza ba'alachsar yachsar. So we'll say, so just to show you essentially what happens over here, what happens halacha l'maisa, right? So imagine Reuben's married to Rachel. Rachel's a kitana. Now Rachel they're getting divorced. So Rachel goes ahead, she appoints a shliach. She says to shliach, you be my shliach lekabbalah. That shliach appears before Reuben, the husband, right? So we'll say, so now Reuben gives the shliach a get. What kind of shliach is that? What kind of shliach? It's either shliach laholacha, right? Because at the end of the day, Rachel can't create a shliach lekabbalah because she is a ketana. Now, because it is a shliach laholacha, when is Rachel divorced? When is she divorced? When the get reaches her hands, which therefore means any time that Reuben wants to renege on that get up until the point that the get reaches the hands of Rachel, he has the ability to do so. She'ein katan osa shliach, because a katan doesn't have the ability to make a shliach. V'im amar lo aviyah, but ultimately again, if amar lo aviyah say v'skabel lebiti gita, now watch this. If Rachel was a ketana married off by her father, and now her father wants her to receive a get, so what does the father do? The father appoints a shliach lekabbalah. Then I will say that works. That works because the father has the ability to operate on behalf of his daughter, so he could create the shliach lekabbalah. Therefore, if he creates the shliach lekabbalah, sends the shliach lekabbalah ultimately again to Reuven to the husband, Reuven places the get in the hand of the shliach lekabbalah in rotza lachzor lo yachzor. We'll say in that case, once the get reaches the hand of the shaliach, ultimately husband can no longer renege. Next, Haomer Tain gets Elishti Makobel was a great case, right? A man says, Haomer Tain gets Elishti. Reuven says to the shaliach, I want to divorce my wife. Give this get to my wife, b'makom ploni, right? I want you to give her the get in Pikesville. Makom ploni, v'nasla b'makom acher. He gives her the get in Owings Mills, right? Right? So what happens? Puzzle. Ultimately, again, the get is puzzle. The get is puzzle. So Gemara says, Hari b'makom ploni. But if Reuven says, listen, he give this get to my wife, I'm pretty sure you're going to find her in Pikesville, right? V'nasla b'makom acher, right? And he gives it to her in Owings Mills. Then what? Kosher, right? Then it's kosher. I'll say why. What's the distinction between the two cases? In case number one, he's giving a specific instruction. In case number two, what is he doing? He's giving helpful information, right? So that you don't have to run out looking for her. I'm pretty sure you're going to find her in Pikesville. Rabbi says into this makom ploni. If a woman says, right, to shaliach, be my shliach lekabbalah, and I want you to receive my get in Pikesville. Right, but he receives in Owings Mills. What's the halacha? Puzzle. Ultimately, again, the get is puzzle. All right, Rabbi Lazar machshir. Rabbi Lazar says, no, it's fine. It's fine. So, kasher. If ultimately, again, Rachel says to the shaliach, bring me my get from so and so place, and the shaliach brings it from a different place, ultimately, again, the get will still be kasher. Fine. So, Rabbi Lazar, will say, why does Rabbi Lazar only argue in the latter case, right? Rabbi Lazar says, I will say, in the first case, where the husband says to the shaliach, give my wife the get in Pikesville, and the shaliach gives it in Owings Mills, the get is puzzle. The get is puzzle. And Rabbi Lazar doesn't argue on that case. Yet on the flip case, where Rachel says, receive my get in Pikesville, and the shaliach receives the get ultimately again in Owings Mills, the Rabbanan say it's puzzle, but Rabbi Lazar says it's kosher. So why does Rabbi Lazar only argue in the latter case and not in the first case? To which the Gemara says, Ihu, the midaita megarish kapid. Ihi, the valkarcha miskarashes mara makomulo. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Lazar says like this. There's a fundamental difference. A man who has ultimately, again, the power of divorce in this case, ultimately, when he says, give the get in a particular place, he is making a tanai, he's making a condition, and non-compliance invalidates the shlichos. A woman ultimately, again, who gets divorced against her will, or who has the ability to get divorced against her will, whenever she gives geographic information according to Rabbi Lazar, she's only giving helpful info. She does not mean to make it a binding condition. But I will say, but again, that's a machlokes Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say, no, if she says, receive my get in a particular place, she's making a binding condition. Rabbi Lazar says it doesn't make sense that she's making geographically binding conditions. Since she could be divorced against her will to begin with, we always view her statements as simply being helpful pieces of information. Along those same lines, the Gemara says, give another example. Mishnah, Haveli Gidi. So also listen to this case. Imagine Rachel's married to Reuven, and Reuven's a Kohen. Now Rachel doesn't come from a Kohanic family. As a result, while she's married to Reuven, she has the ability to what? To eat truma. To eat truma. So watch this. Now Rachel says to the shaliach, Haveli Gidi, ocheles b'truma ad sheyagia get liyada. So if Rachel says to her shaliach, bring me my get, right, bring my get. So in this case again, he's a shliach lava. She could eat truma until when? Till the get actually gets to her hand. Fine. Hiskabel Gidi. On the other hand, if she appoints the shliach as a shliach lekabbalah, Now I will say, when does Rachel become divorced in a case of a sheikh lekabbalah? When, as soon as the get reaches the shliach's hands, then asura lecho b'truma miyad. Then she can't eat truma immediately. Why? Because she has to be chosheshes that maybe by in other words, if she sits down to eat truma, maybe the shliach already received my get. Hiskaber legiti makom ploni. Now, if she said to the shliach, receive my get in a specific place, receive my get Davkun Pikesville, right? Then ocheles b'truma achi agila osamakom. She could eat truma until the shliach gets. Right, until the get gets to that particular place. Rabbi Lazar Osamiyah. Rabbi Lazar says no, she can't eat truma even immediately. So Rabbi says, so now interestingly enough, the Gemara says, Vigita miyahavi. Now interestingly enough, what you see from that latter case, ultimately, again I will say, is that aloch l'maisa, the get is a good get. I v'ha amrit reisha lo havigita, but you just said in the previous Mishnah that such a get would not be a good get. To which the Gemara says, I'm sorry, lo havigita, lo tzricha da amrale hiskabe legita masamachasya. So we'll say, lo tzricha da amrale hiskabe legita masamachasya. The zimnin the mishkachas la bebavel. I will say, what's the case? The case of it is where she's saying, I want you to receive my get in masamachasya. So on one hand, she's giving a specific location, receive my get in masamachasya. That's the name of a place. But sometimes you'll find him in Bavel. This is what she means to say. Mishkal kalecha de mishkachas shakle mine. What she's really saying, we'll say in that kind of case is, take the get wherever you can find the get. Right, wherever you can find the get. So she's giving helpful geographic information. So mishkal kalecha de mishkachas shakle mine. Amid Beis, Gita lohavi adamatas lamasa mechasya. So this process is interesting. So in this case over here, the way the Gemara is setting up the case is she's telling the shaliach, receive the get, get the get from him wherever you could get it. But the get doesn't actually take effect until when? Until ultimately you reach a particular location. So we'll say this is a unique kind of case where she's essentially saying, receive the get wherever you could find my husband, but Lamai said the get itself will not take effect until you bring it to a particular geographic location. Okay, Rabbi Lazar Oster Miyad. So Rabbi Lazar says that ultimately, again, she can't eat truma immediately. So we'll say, so remember again, that this is the last case of the Mishnah. Last case in the Mishnah is, the way we're now framing it is, what she's saying is like this, is receive the get from my husband, which is now we're interpreting to mean, halacha l'maisa, receive the get from my husband wherever you could find him, but halacha l'maisa, I'm not going to be divorced until the get actually reaches a particular geographic location. Now Rabbi Lazar says, in that kind of case, as soon as she dispatches the shaliach, she can't eat truma immediately. That's his best. She can't eat truma immediately. Says the Gemara, Pshita, the Hamara Makom Hula. They will say that makes perfect sense because now what we're saying is she wasn't literally saying only receive the get in a particular place. What she was saying was what? She was just trying to give the shaliach, Mara Makno also means she was giving the shaliach a geographic heads up. You're going to have probably you're going to find my husband in this particular place. To which the Gemara says very interesting. Listen to this. Zil Mizrach, the Isib Mizrach. But so here's what she's saying. She's saying to the shaliach, go to the east because you'll find my husband in the east. That's where he is. The Ka'azal Amayraf. And we'll say, what does the shaliach do? Right after Rachel gives him the instructions, we'll say, what does he do? He goes to the west. Ma'uditema b'mayrav halese. What would you have thought? For sure in the west, he's not going to be there. Kamash Malon Dilma Bahadi Dika. So we'll say, so watch this. So here's what's happening over here. Rachel's married to Reuven. Reuven's a Kohen. So during marriage, she's obviously consuming truma. Now they're getting divorced. So I will say, so now what we're focused on over here in this case is what? At what point in time does she have to stop eating truma? That's what we're really focused on. So Rabbi Lazar says, as soon as she dispatches the shaliach, she has to stop eating truma immediately. Now, what's the chiddush? So we'll say, here's the chiddush. Imagine, so fine. So now Rachel appoints the shaliach. She says, shliach, listen, I don't know exactly where my husband is, but I know he's towards the east. He's in the east. Okay. So I'll say, so now what happens? Shliach leaves the house. She's watching out of the window. And where does the shaliach go? To the west. So we'll say, so I'm going to thought like this. So we'll say, if you're Rachel, what are you thinking? For sure, I could eat truma now. Right? In other words, look, he's mamish going in the wrong direction. It's fine. He'll catch on, go in the wrong direction, but I could for sure eat truma. Kamash malon dilma bahadi de kaazal megas gayas bay. So I said the chiddush of Rabbi Elazar is no kamash malon. Even though now he's going in the wrong direction, halacha lamaisa, she can't eat truma. Why? What do we have to be concerned about? Maybe he's going to bump into her. I'm sorry, maybe Ruvain is going to bump into Shaliach. In other words, even though he's going, quote unquote, in the wrong direction, maybe they will end up bumping into each other. He'll give the Shaliach the get, and therefore she has to stop eating truma immediately. Okay, that's the chiddush of Rabbi Elazar. Which Rabbi Elazar, essentially what Rabbi Elazar is saying, you know what he's essentially saying? Is like once Rachel dispatches the Shaliach to retrieve her get, she just has to stop. Because since we have absolutely no idea how the events are going to unfold, we can't risk having a non-Kohen go ahead and consume truma. So essentially, once you dispatch that shaliach, you're done with truma. Fine. Next, we'll say, so a similar case. Omer l'shlucho, unrelated to Gittin now. Omer l'shlucho, Ariv li b'tmarim. So we'll say, so now remember again, I need to make an erev chatzeros, right? So we'll say, so imagine for a moment, we all live in the same chasser, in the same courtyard, right? Mashiach comes, can you imagine again, we have a Daf Yomi courtyard in Mir Hashem, right? So all of us learning together, living next to each other. So I say, so what happens? We all live in the same chasser, which means that halacha l'maisa now, we need to join in an eruv in order for us to be able to carry from our homes to the jointly owned chasser. Okay? So I say, so now what happens? I say to the Shaliach, so now I'm in charge of the Eruv. I say to my Shaliach, do me a favor, go and make the Eruv from Tamarim, from dates. What happened? The Shaliach goes ahead, the Eruv lo begrogros. He makes it with dried figs. Or I tell him begrogros, the Eruv lo betamarim. So we'll say, so now what happens if the Shaliach ends up using something different for the Eruv than what I told him to use? So what's the status of the Eruv? Tani chad Eruv Eruv. So we'll say so one opinion says the Eruv is a good Eruv. The Tanya idach ein Eruv Eruv. And one opinion says it's not a good Eruv. Not a good Eruv. So what's going on over here? Actually, I take it back. Rashi actually says that this is a case not of Eruv Chaseros, but of Eruv Tchumen. Right? Okay, not that it matters. Right? Fine. So what's the halacha? Amarab alo kasha. Harabanan Harab Elazar. So we'll say it's two different opinions. Harabanan Dami Kapeda. Harabanan Dami Kapeda. Harab Elazar the Amr Mara Makamula. So we'll say Zimar wants to suggest, or Rabbi wants to suggest, this is the same machlokes as our Mishnah. Right? So we'll say, what happens halacha l'maisa when the woman says, receive my get in Pikesville? So the Rabbanan say, when she says receive my get in Pikesville, that's Kapeda. She's saying, I only want you to receive my get in Pikesville. Rabbi Elazar says, no. What is she doing? We'll say, it's a Mara Makom. She's providing helpful information. So Rabbi wants to suggest it's the same machlokis over here. When I say to my Shaliach, make an Eruv with my dates. So the Rabbanan will say, what am I saying? Dates, tafka dates and nothing else. And therefore, again, if he uses something else, what's the halacha? The Eruv is invalid. Rabbi Elazar will say, when I say dates, what am I saying? Mara Makom, just get it done. By the way, the dates, they're right at the front door, right? So just take the dates, right? But Lamai said, it's a Mara Makom. I don't really care what he uses. I'm just trying to provide helpful information. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef says no. So Rabbi Yosef Amar, ha v'ha Rabbanon. Actually, I will say, both brises are the Rabbanon. So we'll say, so what's going on over here? Listen to this. The Rabbanon are the ones who say that ultimately, again, Kpeda, kan b'shalo, the kan b'shal chavero. Very interesting. I will say, when it's talking about my produce, when it's talking about my friend's produce. So there's Rose saying, when it's my produce, I'm fine if the shaliach uses the grogros instead of the tamarim. Doesn't matter to me. He uses the dates, uses dried figs, doesn't make a difference. The other case Rose says, when I'm telling the shaliach to use Ruvain's produce. Ruvain gave me permission to use his produce for Eruv. That will say, when someone gives you permission to use their stuff, what permission do you have? What right? To use dafka, the items they allowed you to use. So in this case over here, Ruvain said, you could use my tamarim. So then if Shaliach goes ahead and uses the grogros of Ruvain, That's unsanctioned use of someone else's property. So Rabbi Yosef it's so interesting way. So Rabbi Yosef is saying both are the position of the Rabbanon. When it comes to my produce, if the shaliach uses tamarim instead of grogers instead of tamarim, that's fine. But Lamaisa, the second brayso that says it's not good is when we're using someone else's produce, right? I was telling the shaliach, Ruvain allowed us to use his tamarim. If the shaliach takes the grogros of Ruvain, well, that's unsanctioned use of someone else's property. Amalei Abaye, Valahadis, what about the following case? Homer l'shlucho, ariv li b'migdal, v'iriv la b'shovach. B'shovach v'iriv la b'migdal. So what about the following case? I say to my shaliach, and I both say this could be a good case of Eruv Tchumen as well, right? Place the Eruv in the tower, but instead the Eruv, the shliach places it in the dovecote, or place it in the dovecote, and he places it in the tower. So we'll say, what's the halacha? The Sanya Chada Eruvo, the Tanya Chada Eruva Eruv, the Tanya Idach Ein Eruva Eruv. So we'll say, one brayso says it is a good Eruv, one brayso says it's not a good Eruv. Hasam Maishalo B'Shach Aveiro Iko. I will say, can you make the same distinction over here that one is talking about my own stuff, one is talking about, again, my friends? Hasam Nami Ika, Peri de Migdal, Peri de Shovach. Rabbi say, Lav Dafka is talking about location, but it's talking about, again, the produce situated in a particular place. Say Nachinami, Rabbi say, could ultimately be, again, Rashi says, "B'migdal diktani lav lan suchehu el arvim peros ploni." We'll say it doesn't have to be talking about actual location, but rather it could be talking about the produce that is stored in these respective locations as well. Okay, interesting idea. Fine. So we'll say, so really, really quite fascinating. So I'll just point out, we have this, so therefore we're left with this machlokes. We're not going to resolve it today, but we're left with this machlokes, Rabbanan and Rabbi Lazar, which is a very interesting machlokes, that ultimately, again, when specifically the wife gives specific information about where to receive the get, how do you interpret that instruction? So the Rabbanan, and so again, Rachel says to the Shaliach, receive my get in Pikesville. So the Rabbanan will say, she's makbid. What she's saying is she only wants the get received in Pikesville, and therefore if the shliach receives it somewhere else, it's not a valid get. That, right? That's ultimately the position of the Rabbanan. That's what we call kpeda. Ultimately, again, the Rabbi Lazar will say no, mara makom. She is providing helpful information, so the shaliach doesn't have to go ahead and start running around looking for where the husband is. But in reality, what does she care about? The Rabbi will say, what does she care about? Getting divorced. Where the get is given is actually of little consequence. So just keep in mind that fascinating machloka. Says the Mishnah, Homer, kisvu getatnu ishti. If a husband says, write it, get and give it to my wife, girshuha, divorce my wife, right? Kisvu igeres etnu, write a letter for her and to give her, right? Give her. Hari ilu yichtabu. So these are all proper lashonos of divorce. So if a husband uses any of this wording, ultimately, again, in the commissioning of agents, these are proper verbal instructions to write and deliver a get. On the other hand, patruha. If you use patruha, right, which literally means you get about to say, like patra, like exempt her. Parnasuha, support her. Asala kanimus, right, do in accordance with the proper way. Asulu karai, do the appropriate thing for her. Lomar klor. Let's say, so these wording, right, this type of verbiage is too open, ultimately, again, and too open-ended and too ambiguous, doesn't result in a get. So we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up in Meretz Hashem also with this Gemara tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a wonderful day, everyone. Shkoyach.